Thank you for joining today's community planning conversation with Richard Jackson. Dr. Jackson, an MD, is in our community today because he's here giving a talk at the 2008 Environmental Horizons Conference that's being sponsored at the university. And before we get into our conversation, I just wanted to give a little bit of background on when and how I didn't actually meet, but first heard Dr. Jackson give a talk at the National American Planning Association conference. We were talking, and we think maybe that was 3 or 4 years ago, held in Denver. And the interesting aspect of this, and why I wanted to give you this background, is at that point in time, Dr. Jackson was with the CDC, and he was looking at, and at the beginning of the curve of looking at the intersection between urban design and obesity. And urban planning was doing that, but we were not getting any attention. And it was the fact that when the CDC started looking at this topic, then it became much more into the conversation of the public. And as you all the viewers know today, this is quite the topic of conversation. And so it is with great delight that we have Dr. Jackson with us this afternoon. Thank you for coming and spending some time with me. And I would like, before we get into what you want to talk about and some of the things you're going to tell our viewers, or as a preview of your talk this evening, what sparked your interest in the intersection of urban planning and urban design and health and obesity?
Patsy, I'm a public health physician. I'm actually a pediatrician by training and worked for 15, 20 years on environmental health issues. I spent about 10 years at the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention in Atlanta working on chemicals in the environment and cancer clusters and body burdens, breast milk concentration of various chemicals. And in 1999, the head of CDC, Dr. Jeff Copeland, asked his 13 directors of the centers there to come to a meeting to talk about the big threats of the 21st century. And as I was driving over, I was driving down a road similar to one that every one of your viewers has driven down. It was 7 lanes wide, 3 in one direction, moving very quickly, 3 in the other, what we call a suicide lane in the middle. And then there were apartments on both sides, 2 and 3 stories high, filled with poor people, working people, immigrants. It was a very hot day. It was about 95 degrees, 95% humidity, and I looked over to the side, and here was a woman walking, carrying a plastic shopping bag, one in each hand. It was terribly hot, and she was in her 70s, and she reminded me of my mother, and I wanted to stop and give her a ride. I didn't do it. Men don't give women rides in the United States.
Men don't stop on, or anybody stop on a 7-lane road either.
But I went to my meeting thinking about the big threats of the 21st century, and I kept thinking about this woman. I thought, if she were to collapse because of the heat, the cause of death would be heat stroke, and it wouldn't be absence of trees, heat island effects, bad air quality. And if she were killed by a truck going by, it would not be because of absence of sidewalks, absence of public transportation, poor urban planning, failed political leadership. And as a result of this, and other things were going on, I went back and began to work with a friend of mine, Dr. Howie Frumkin. We wrote the book that I'd like to show on the screen here, Urban Sprawl and Public Health. No one had really thought about sprawl in health. People had talked a lot about old, dense housing and people getting tuberculosis and many other things, but actually the way we had built modern America influencing someone's health was a big change from in the past. I'd like to take you through some slides of what's gone on. I think, is it all right?
Sure, absolutely.
I think one of the things that we Americans tend to think that, our health is being taken care of. We spend 17% of all the dollars in the United States right now for medical care. And yet it's the public health interventions, the things we do upstream, clean air, clean water, clean food, better housing, better access to the people around us, the support systems, that have really improved our health over the last 100 years. In fact, only 5 years have come from medicine, and 25 years have come from better environments and immunizations and a few other things like that. Today in America, the leading causes of death aren't tuberculosis and infectious diseases anymore. They're chronic diseases. They're diseases that stay with us for a long time, like cancer and asthma and arthritis, diabetes, obesity-related diseases. And in many ways, the second cause of death 120 years ago was consumption. In many ways today, one of our chief killers is consumption. And it's not just the way we consume food, but it's the way we consume land. It's the way we consume energy in our society. And I'm arguing, and I will argue tonight, that we are in for a perfect storm. We're in a perfect storm because of crushing healthcare costs with the epidemic of diabetes and other chronic diseases. We're in a perfect storm in terms of the end of oil and the saturation of our atmosphere with carbon dioxide and the byproducts of our energy systems. And we're in a perfect storm with the depletion of resources because of our high levels of consumption in our society. When I was a young doctor, only 7% of all the money in the United States was being spent on medical care. We're now spending 17%. And yet, the average American wouldn't say, I feel that much better. I mean, we've made advances, but we really haven't improved the quality of people's lives to the degree that we've spent money on it.
Nor have people's salaries increased enough to cover that increase.
You're absolutely right. In fact, our salaries have pretty much flatlined in real dollars over that same period of time. The one big change over the last 30 to 40 years is we have consumed enormous amounts more land as we've built larger and larger homes, further and further out. The idea 30, 40 years ago of someone driving 50 or 60 or 70 miles each way to commute to a job would seem bizarre, and yet everyone that's listening to this program knows someone that's commuting that level of distance all the time. Lots of fuel, lots of pollution, lots of white-knuckle stress when it's snowing or raining or they're late for a meeting or something else.
And we should tell the viewing audience that the community you were talking about originally, where you saw the lady with the bag of groceries, was probably Atlanta.
It was Atlanta, because that's where the Centers for Disease Control is.
That's right, and Atlanta does have that heat island hanging over that. And then your other example probably comes a lot out of California, where you have spent quite a bit of time.
California's done a massive amount of building. When I was a medical student, the state was only 17 million people. It's now 37 million people, and it will be 50 million people. So thinking that we can consume land and consume resources as if it's a never-ending stream of it will end. In fact, in 1945, the leading agricultural county in the United States for both food production and value of the crops produced was Los Angeles. And Los Angeles opted for sprawl, moving people further and further apart, more time in the car. Basically, the place is paved over, and it now has to import its strawberries from
Mexico.
Or Chile.
Or like all of us do.
Right. And so we've become more and more disconnected from that which gives us sustenance, you know, our food and even our water systems in some ways. And we've become more disconnected from the people around us because we're sitting in a box at home. We're sitting in a box getting to wherever we're going. We're in a box. We watch a box on our desks. We go about our day in increasing isolation. And the point of my whole talk is that we are paying the health costs of this problem. Here's a picture from northeastern Atlanta of whether 23 lanes will be enough. And of course, there are never enough lanes. You have to eventually move towards density and public transportation.
And just a quick aside, back to Atlanta and this picture, we were talking, I do have a daughter who lives in Atlanta, and I commented, as you fly into the airport there, I said I thought I was starting with Atlanta and it was taking so long, and she said, no, that was Chattanooga. People in Atlanta now just view Chattanooga, Tennessee as a suburb of Atlanta, so.
And that's about 80 miles.
These lanes are quite real.
You know, the term is used, Charlantingham, because it's essentially paved and developed now all the way from Charlotte, North Carolina to Birmingham, Alabama.
Oh, that I didn't know. Okay.
And, that didn't happen when people used much more transit. But also back when towns were really nodes and collections of cultural need and retail need and social need that came together for people, and they had a life in those towns.
That's right.
I'll skip a couple of these, but I want to...
You skipped your favorite picture.
The point of this slide is this is pretty much what we build in the United States. And people say, well, that's what I want. I want an isolated home that I can drive up the driveway and the garage door will open and I'll drive in and the door will close and I don't have to deal with anybody. But the truth is that that's what's been marketed to us. We've incentivized it with tax policies, and we've supported the highways, and we've supported the FHA program and the mortgage programs, and encourage people to move towards more and more independent and isolated housing. But we're paying a price for this. We're paying a price because, number one, people don't walk. And their socialization now is around the television or the home theater or in more and more isolated and not in their community. And the kids are bored silly in places like this.
Let me just probe you with a question that you can talk to our viewers about, and that is the lack of connectivity that exists and what that means related to what you're talking about.
People say that what do they really want in a business if you go into business? And what you want in business is you want to be able to meet up and connect and do your trade or do your work with other people. If you want to ward off depression in our society, what are the best ways to do it? Culturally, we human beings have figured out we've got to be around other people. Even psychotherapy is essentially talking and connecting with other people. The other thing that wards off depression is exercise. And when one lives in a community like this, you can't go for a walk very easily. Even to get a carton of milk 2 blocks away, you have to get in the car.
You can't go to the Starbucks.
And these neighborhoods encourage, and the schools are moved further and further out because of the low density, and the children have to be taken to school, 5-7 miles sometimes. And we've all seen the schools crowded with cars, the SUVs dropping off one child after another, and dramatic decrease in the number of children walking to school in America, something like from 66% down to 13% in one generation. Dramatic increase in the lack of fitness in our kids in America. In my state, and I was health officer, I was the head doctor for the state of California, 75% of the kids in California could not pass a fitness gram test, which means they could not walk a 12-minute mile. And I would say California is such a big state, it's kind of average for the United States. It's not that it's unusual there. So we've removed walking from kids' lives, and we've changed their diets, so more and more of them are becoming obese. This slide is a map of obesity in the United States in 1990. So we see Illinois, looks like about 10 to 15% of Illinois is obese back in 1990. Obese, I won't get into the definition of it, but it's an increase what we call body mass index, body to height level. Here it is in 1997. Illinois is now at still 15 to 19%, but getting close to over 20% of the population being obese. What do you think it is in 2004? Still about 20 to 24%, but the other states, a brand new color, over 25% of the population obese. This has multiple reasons. One is that we've saturated our diet with cheap calories, high fructose corn sugar and fast food, and that tastes good but is loaded with fat, loaded with salt, loaded with sugars. And we've engineered exercise out of our lives, particularly the best exercise that we can do, which is walking. This epidemic of obesity has changed every aspect of our lives. Ambulances now have to be made much heavier. They're much more expensive. The gurneys in a hospital, the stretchers that are used, have to be much heavier and are more expensive. And the most rapidly increasing surgery in America, the most rapidly increasing surgery in America is stomach stapling surgery. They call it bariatric surgery. And you don't need to be an epidemiologist to look at a curve, and when you see the numbers going up and up and up like that, that's an epidemic.
And I'm sure the viewers are immediately saying, but does it work long-term?
Does the surgery work?
Long-term. What is being found? There's enough longitudinal data now that I'm sure there's some.
That's a very good question. The best way to control weight is, reduce the calories and increase the burn. More exercise and reduce your caloric intake, the food that you eat. And ideally lose about 1 pound a week. It can take a couple of years for some people to lose enough weight to really get at a healthful level. That's the best way to do it, both exercise and controlling of intake. For some individuals who've become so overweight and they're carrying so much weight that they are stressing their pancreas, they're becoming diabetic, they're stressing their joints, they barely can breathe, they have apnea at night.
Why don't
the
you
surgery,
explain what apnea?
I'm sorry, apnea, breathing problems at night, often associated with snoring or actually long periods where they stop breathing, sleep disorders. Folks like this end up benefiting from this surgery, at least for a few years. It is not a cheap surgery. It's $35,000 to $50,000. It does have complications, and it does have people that, there are individuals where it doesn't work. But I guess my larger point is, there's no doctor that's going to recommend surgery if at all possible someone can control a problem like this with non-surgical, non-medical means, namely nutrition. But the other point I want to make is the way we design our communities makes it impossible for lots of people to go for a walk. And every one of us has been in a community where, you'd like to walk to school, you'd like to walk to the store, you'd like to tell your children, go walk to school, but there's no sidewalks, there's no eyes in the street. We're not really comfortable walking past bare walls and in places where there's not at least a level of human presence. And by eyes in the street, we used to design communities with front porches and sidewalks that went by, and you knew your neighbors and you said hello, and you felt comfortable walking in places like that. No one feels comfortable walking past a bare wall or walking in the gutter between rapidly moving cars and a cluttered landscape on the right side. So we've gone out of our way. We spent huge amounts of money in the United States to build communities that work well for cars, and that don't work well for people, and especially don't work well for children, for old people, for poor people, for disabled people, and people that don't drive.
Very true. Just for our viewers to cement your argument, I now have a pup, not an older dog, so I can walk that dog longer distances. And I live in West Champaign and was going to walk over to a copy shop, which meant I had to cross Mattis. Our viewers will understand this. Mattis is a very busy street, and actually chose not to do it, not because I have the older dog that limited the distance I would walk. I didn't want the challenge of crossing Mattis, so I got in the car, drove over there, came back, and then walked the dog within my neighborhood. So just underlying your point that connectivity didn't exist for me to walk that distance over to the copy shop, which was quite a shame because it isn't that far away.
Well, and the truth is your dog needed the exercise, you needed the exercise, the contact with your neighbors, if they happened to be doing the same thing, would have been good. You would have cared about, you
That's
might
right.
have had another piece of business because you saw another shop that you might want to
Exactly.
go into. Unfortunately, for many of these busy streets, they don't even time them so an older person could get across the street in any reasonable amount of time.
Repeat that.
What I'm driving
that's
at
a
is,
very
let's say
important point.
you have the green light for 12 seconds. Maybe if you're an 18-year-old track star, you can get across with no trouble at all in 12 seconds. But for a lot of citizens, it's very, very hard.
And you don't necessarily need to be elderly. If you have a gait problem or knee problems,
Pushing a baby carriage.
a lot of other reasons that we need to give people a little bit more time.
And you know what's the challenging thing about this is, so let's say an individual goes to the doctor and says to the doctor, And the doctor says, you know, you need to lose weight, you need to exercise. And then the person goes home and there's no place to walk. The doctor hasn't done that person any good, and the person then goes back and feels personally to blame. It's not them. And we're in the city council chambers. It's the leaders of our communities that are not building things for people.
And not requiring, that's the picture, your favorite picture there of the hair follicle design of the suburb. There were no sidewalks.
The crushed worm.
Yes, right. There were no sidewalks. So how do the people do that, or how do the children feel that freedom, a sense of being able to ride, to get an ice cream cone or something very, very simple such as that?
When kids don't exercise, actually they become more hyperactive, they learn more poorly. They actually need to have exercise built in their lives. They need to have green contact in their lives. They need to be around natural features. Kids that are around natural features learn better, play better. In fact, the University of Illinois is some of the premier researchers in this whole
That's
area.
correct. In kinesiology, they're doing a
Right.
lot of this.
Wonderful and thoughtful work. When I was a young pediatrician, I would go to the diabetes clinic, and we'd see children with diabetes. And in those days, it was kids with insulin-dependent diabetes. Essentially, it's an autoimmune disease that they needed to have shots of insulin. We never saw a child with adult-onset diabetes. Now, a third of all the kids in the diabetes clinic have adult-onset diabetes or obesity-related diabetes. Dramatic change over just one generation. The average 11-year-old in America is 11 pounds heavier than he was in 1973. The average American adult is 25 pounds heavier, less fit and more overweight. And it's really very worrisome, because if these trends continue, a third of our children, think about your beloved, children and grandchildren, nieces and nephews, a third of them will be diabetic in their lifetime if these trends continue. And it means that their expected lifespan will be about 15 years less. Their quality of life will be 20 years less, because your quality of life, if you're on dialysis and have gangrene from diabetes, is not going to be very good. And perhaps the first generation in history to live less long than your parents. So this issue of both getting control of what we're eating and what's available in our schools, and I'll come back to that, and the degree of exercise in our lives, how many calories we burn off with incidental exercise, really is a matter of life or death. It's not simply cosmetics, and it is not right to blame individuals. It is a whole system that is driving people in these directions.
And to maybe I'm leaping ahead on your slides, and if so, you can say that you'll talk about it in a few minutes. But what about the research that has been done related to setting in a pattern when children are younger of exercise, and that's just a part of their lives, so as they become adults, then that continues to be their pattern, as compared to if the pattern is driving them to school and then driving them to the store, then as adults, and that is what they assume is the pattern because that is what they saw as a child.
Patsy, you're really pointing out both physical and psychological issues. That, a child that's accustomed to walking, to being in nature, to having a reasonable amount of autonomy, to meeting a stranger and having confidence to deal in a strange situation, that child's better equipped for the world than a child who is forever protected. Now, your listeners may say, well, there's a lot of bad people out there, and there are dangerous people and perverts and all the rest. Well, the truth is that the actuarial risk, the actual number risk, is no different than it was a generation ago. Well, you have news media that aggravate and make people much more alarmed.
So it's a
about
perceptual
it.
issue.
So it's a perception that it's much worse. The second issue is that parents probably need to walk as well. So if you're worried about your child walking to school by herself, then why not put a walking school bus together?
I was going to ask you about that.
You can't do a walking school bus, and all that is the parents do one day a week they take turns walking with a bunch of the kids, and it's fun, and mom and dad get exercise, and the kids get to know the neighbors, and they become accustomed to it. And then but eventually you have to develop that kind of autonomy. I blame the schools a little bit because they've built schools that are
On
very
the
far
fringe.
away and very big, very difficult. And a lot of the schools are giving too much book carrying. So kids are carrying 20 and 25 pounds worth of books in a backpack. And I don't know the solution to that, but somehow we learned when I was a kid, and we weren't carrying that much weight of books back and forth all the time. I think they just figured because they're being in a car, it doesn't matter.
Well, you've hit on a topic that's very close to our community, especially the Champaign side of Wright Street, because they're in the process right now of talking about building new schools. Some have to be done because of a court decree, and that doesn't quite apply to what you're talking about. But they are also talking about building a new high school campus. And of course, the whole conversation is that campus has to have 60 acres, and 60 acres will only be found on the edge of town. And of course, land will be less expensive, or somebody will donate that and they can write it off. Talk a little bit more about how communities might engage in thinking and problem solving to use the schools that already exist, but to expand them and to take advantage of that and still keep it within the hub of the community so it doesn't end up on the fringe.
I'd like every listener to think to yourself, where do kids learn better, big schools or small schools? The scientific answer is small schools. Where do they behave better? Small schools. Where are they happier? Where are the teachers happier? Small schools. And yet we persist in building
These
bigger
campuses.
and bigger schools.
Mm-hmm.
And I was very involved in California before I left in the school siting guidelines, where the grammar schools had to have 10 acres, and the middle schools 20 acres, and the high schools 30 acres. And the health officers, the county health officers, the 58 county health officers felt so strongly about this. They wrote to the State Board of Education saying, we urge you to go back to small schools. The kids are more likely to be engaged in their community, to be physically fit. The kids behave better, and all the rest. We got the Academy of Pediatrics to sign on to that petition, and we got the California Medical Association, all the doctors in the state, to endorse that. The poor schools are under such a financial squeeze that there are reasons why they want to build out on land. But of course, you build further out, then you need those additional 30 acres for parking, and you need the bus going back and forth. But the bus is an annual cost, it's not the capital cost, so it's not,
Right.
30 years of bus is not calculated into the cost
Right.
of that supposed cheaper building out on the cheaper land.
That's right.
I think the era of bigger and bigger schools, they don't work. They don't work for kids. They do work for short-term economic benefits. Even Bill and Melinda Gates have a $1 billion foundation pushing for small schools. That's how strongly they feel about it and how strong the data is that they're better.
And can I get you to segue then, not only to talk about the smaller schools, but the relationship of how the behavior of students in schools that are built with green construction?
Well, you know, it's funny, in the early 1900s, there were guidelines for how to build a school. And one was there had to be east side windows. The sunlight would come in from the east side. The area had to be 2/3 the floor area, so there was good daylighting. The windows had to open so they would ventilate, and a couple other requirements. These were actually green schools. This was the ventilation, you know, and they were heated. We've moved to schools that really follow almost a prison model. And so we use fossil fuels to put lights in a room that if they had skylights, they could actually have daylight. If you have daylight in a room, the sleep hormone, melatonin, goes down and you become more alert. If you have daylight in the room, serotonin, the alertness hormone, goes up. And by the way, the antidepressant hormone goes up. So there are lots of benefits for having daylight. A sealed room, and there are a lot of kids now in these, they call them portables, but you know, they look like trailers to me. The air quality in them is often not very good. There's a lot of formaldehyde-containing particle board in them, and they re-entrain the same air over and over again in that closed space. One of the real disasters for schools was when we decided that kids shouldn't be able to look out the window because it distracted them. What possible nonsense after 100,000 years of human development did we possibly think that children shouldn't be able to look at trees and bushes while they were learning? I mean, if the teacher can't keep them alert because there's a bush out there, then maybe they shouldn't be teaching. There's good evidence that kids learn better. And by the way, I was in a big fight when I was health officer for California, pushing for green schools. I did not win it because the Department of Education said they cost 3% more. But the payback was under 1 year in terms of energy efficiency, and that was without calculating the better academic scores for children in these classrooms with better air quality, better light quality.
And just to insert and remind our viewers, when I had the conversation with Don Fournier, who is now chair of the Building Research Council, which is connected to our School of Architecture, he brought with him the policy of Massachusetts, which you may or may not be aware of, and the data from a built school in that state. And indeed, it is 3 to 4% more to actually do the building. There are charts that show the payback comes because of all the energy saved. But because there is that initial increase, the state of Massachusetts is covering that for schools. And then they did find, and that's what led me to ask you this question, is how much better the performance of the students is, and also the decrease of behavior problems.
It's absolutely true.
In the schools. So maybe you could speak a little bit more to the behavior issue, because
we've seen a 3 to 4-fold increase in the use of Ritalin, methylphenidate, the drug that's used for hyperactivity in children in the United States over the last 30 years. No one really knows the cause, but every parent knows that a child who's had a chance to run around and exercise is more manageable, more tractable, and easier to deal with than a child who's just needs to get out and run around. Your puppy would be miserable if
I didn't walk it to Kinko's.
That's right, you didn't walk him.
And Cross Mattis, right?
Right. The evidence is there. Children who walk, learn, play, and exercise better and more than kids that don't. Kids that are in classrooms that are day-lit with fresh air in them do better, and the teachers are happier in them. The windows don't distract kids, they actually perform better. I sound like I'm bashing the schools. The poor schools have had, in many ways, they're underfunded, but they've given up on a lot of things that really almost make life worth living. You know, music, art, and exercise are being cut because of tightness, of tight budgets. And we so emphasize the math and the English, the verbal skills, to the detriment of those aspects that really enrich lives.
Well, and actually, as I'm listening to your explanation and your arguments, there potentially is some budgetary savings if, in fact, they don't have as many behavioral problems. Or our schools, and I'm sure other schools across the country now, have safety officers in them. This was a big crisis, especially in the Champaign School District, not so much in Urbana, so that was added cost to the school budget. And so we need to talk a little bit more over time on those issues, that how can these decision makers learn more about what you are explaining to our viewers, so that they make healthier decisions and actually save money on their budget in the long run.
You know, Patsy, I think you're actually talking about the big issue from this whole conversation. The brilliance of the 20th century was we specialized everything. You know, medicine broke down into 20 subspecialties. We had pediatric psychiatry and the rest. And economics broke into smaller areas, and transportation, and the whole world became more and more fragmented. And yet we fail to look at the fact that most of the problems we deal with are operating throughout somebody's life. And a child, for example, doesn't know that their challenge, the problem that they're dealing with, are touching on 20 governmental specialties at one time and 20 academic specialties at one time, and we've forgotten what this is really about. It's really about giving our children a world that works as well as the one we were given, a world that is as beautiful and diverse and healthful as the one we were given. And I'm very worried that that's exactly not what we are doing. We are depleting it. 20% of mammalian species are likely to disappear in the next 20 to 30 years because of what we're doing. The same with fish species. The level of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere because of our rampant overuse of fuels. Half of all the stuff we burn is wasted. Really doesn't create any real benefit. We could, so we're depleting the atmosphere, we're saturating the atmosphere with carbon dioxide, we're warming the planet, and it's just headlong selfishness by the generation that's now stealing from our children and our grandchildren. And I can't think of anything more boneheaded.
Did I derail you too much from your slides? You have your diabetes slide. But it was such a good conversation. I didn't mean to derail you too much here.
You know, no. I think a lot of this is, I've talked about a bunch of negatives, so let me talk about
importance of farmers markets.
Let me talk about some positives. One is every child ought to be able to walk safely to school. Now, admittedly, if you're living 20 miles out in a very rural area, that probably can't happen. But in general, it does mean we need to improve our schools. Our inner city schools are not good, and parents pick where they're going to live based upon their schools. Two, every school ought to have a garden. There's schools in Northern California, school districts where all the food in that school district is being produced by the middle and the high school students working on
And why don't you
school
give a little history
garden.
to how that started in Berkeley as Chez Pan?
You know, probably the restaurant that's most responsible for the change in American cuisine, American diet, the quality of American food, is something called Chez Panisse, run by Alice Waters in Berkeley. 10 years ago, she looked at the food that was being supplied to kids in the schools, and it was essentially mostly corn-derived products in one form or another. She hired a very good chef. They began to grow food in the gardens there. The kids learned how to grow the food. Kids brought in their grandparents sometimes to teach in the preparation of the food. I had the pleasure of going to one of them, and here was a third grader chopping away with on some broccoli rabe at the time. It was really, but they thought the food was great. And everyone said, oh, kids won't eat that stuff. The kids would rather eat it than pizza. And you have to start young, and they've got to know where it comes from. It has to be fresh, and it has to be good. You know, nobody wants to eat stale green beans that were in a can 12 hours before, really.
And she successfully has infused this throughout the school district.
It has gone throughout thank you very much, the whole school district. It has not gotten to the whole state, but Governor Schwarzenegger did ban soft drinks from the school, did ban junk food from the schools. People said, oh, the kids will go and steal pizzas somewhere else. But the adoption really has moved it has become common sense. Well, you don't eat that kind of stuff all the time. You need to be eating decent food. And it's so fun to see children teaching their parents instead of the other way around. The same thing that happened with tobacco, really, in a lot of ways.
Well, and maybe there will be a wedge, this might be a stretch, but with corn being shifted over as the alternative fuel, and this is raising the cost of these junk foods now because they are basically corn-based, this may be just the time to move more school cafeterias to healthier eating and eliminating more of the corn-based. I don't know, it's a real stretch, I realize.
You know, the truth is maybe this is a takeaway here. We have not been very mindful about what we eat. We have not been mindful about the places that we build. We've not been mindful about the care of our own bodies, particularly exercise. And we've not been mindful about the planet and the resources that we're using. And I think that's the big challenge of the 21st century, is this mindfulness that we have to bring to it.
We do, this is a bit of tongue-in-cheek, but it is serious. A physical therapist friend of mine said as we were both aging along the way, he said that if I'd known I was going to live this long, I would have taken better care of my body.
I heard Mickey Mantle was the first person I heard say
Oh,
that.
okay, maybe that's where it originated, but it isn't so much tongue-in-cheek. And as we're younger, we don't think these things are important. And as we get older, we realize how important they are.
I think I may have taken out this slide. I don't have it in here.
But you could talk about it.
They're fascinating study. 100,000 nurses were identified in the mid-1970s, and they were followed for the next 25, 30 years. The nurses who became obese died at a 90% higher rate. But the nurses who became unfit died at a 60% higher rate.
Repeat that. This is something that...
The nurses who lost their fitness, now I'm not talking running marathons, but just had become, they couldn't do a reasonable amount of walking, had become unfit. 60% higher death rate, 90% higher death rate if they became obese. And if they became obese and unfit, 2.5 times the death rate. When I was in med school, I wasn't taught that fitness was a matter of life or death. I was taught that obesity was a real threat to your health, but I wasn't taught fitness, loss of fitness was. And it doesn't take a lot of work. 10,000 steps a day, it's about 4 or 5 miles, it's a fair amount of walking. And it's hard to do it if you're just getting up and you're gonna go walk by yourself. It's important to have friends, it's important to have
the social aspect.
It's important to have a pup, it's important to have a place to go. And so building places that attract us and make us want to go somewhere is actually going to improve our health, as well as maybe our mental health and our social health at the same time.
This reminds me when I adopted the dog from the Humane Society, and when I was standing there signing the paperwork, there is a book that they have at the Champaign County Humane Society, and probably at other humane societies, that says lose weight with your newly adopted dog, and it confirms what you've just said. And there's another place. How can we make it easier for people to get pets and less expensive so that they indeed do think of this, and that it's not just for the exercise, it is for companionship. It's another social aspect of how can we facilitate this.
Well, you know, this is the public health doctor. I have the opposite sort of anxiety about this, because particularly in I'll just say it, largely Latino, poor Latino communities in California, there's a lot of dogs, and the dogs are kept for security purposes.
I see, okay.
And it scares kids especially, but it scares anyone to walk past a place that's got a really aggressive dog. And so I know you're suggesting that pets are great, and pets are great, and people that have pets live longer and are happier, but they got to be loved pets that are well taken care of.
Yes, yes, they're no different than, they take as much work as a child. Absolutely no question about that.
Yeah, but they're more no.
They're more rewarding. I don't know, this 8-month-old puppy, there are times that he is demolishing my backyard right now. Another part that I'd like to tap into your expertise in all of these, this breadth of experience that you've had, again, for our viewers, talk about some of the things that they can do related to coming before their city councils or their school boards or their planning commissions. Help them get those tools, those argument tools, so that they can maybe challenge, but let's frame it differently, say that isn't there another way that we could view this, and here are some things they might be doing.
You know, I'm more focused on the health community because I am a physician. Right. I've worked extensively with the county health departments in California. Half of the county health departments now have a staff person, often a nurse, who goes to the planning commission meetings. It's often a woman, will track what proposals are coming up for a development or something else, and we'll go to the hearing and say, how can people walk here? Where's the public transportation? How can someone who's sight impaired, how can a child get from one place to another? Riverside County has 4 staff that are doing that right now. San Diego has 2 staff. The thing that's very interesting is after a relatively short amount of time, the planning commissioners begin to understand that this is important. One of my favorite stories was that a bicycle route had come up for a vote, and they were having difficulty getting this bicycle route trail approved. And joke, the people with the padded pants went to the hearing and were arguing for the bicycle route, but it was seen as a sort of a small sector of the population.
An elite group.
Elite group, right. But they had endorsement from the Diabetes Association and the Heart Association and the Nurses Association, and actually some of them came to the hearing and argued for the bicycle route as a health intervention for the community. And the thing passed. Because somebody in the city council's got diabetes, and somebody's got heart disease, and somebody needs to be out walking too. So formulating it and using these health arguments can often advance it. The other argument you're going to get against you when you show up is you're going to say, oh, we built a bike route and people don't use it. And I will say that bicycle routes and trails, which are very good in parks also, need to have destinations. Just building them without a place to start and a place to go to, people don't use them, and you do have to market them a little bit. Once people get in the habit of using them and feel confident and feel safe, they'll use it. But there has to be a certain amount of marketing, town festival, or it should go from a band shell, let's say, to a retail area or something else. But there'd be places that people could go to, and having a school or two on the route is terrific.
That and I'm sure you probably have a slide showing this where somebody puts their bikes in a car to drive to the trail because there's no connectivity to safely get to that point. Then they get their bikes off and take advantage of the trail and then put the bikes back on the car and go home.
I think I did that 100 times when I lived in Atlanta because there was no way with
there's no connectivity. There's not much connectivity.
With our 3 sons, we could get to the bicycle route without it. And that was a pretty substantial investment in bicycle racks.
Right, right. And that's and this is probably very close. This makes a lot of sense to the folks here in Urbana because they have just recently approved the beginning plans of bicycle routes and bicycle pathways throughout their community. And even though they are talking to each other, we've got Urbana, we've got the university, and then we have Champaign. And they really need to be talking to each other on how they will.
It's got to be regional. How
they connect, and even larger than that, because there's a big conversation. We are sort of offset in relationship to our county, and all the major population is right here in these cities. Well, but what about these children out here in the summertime? How are they going to get around, and how do we create some bicycle pathways and connectivity so they can actually ride into Urbana or Champaign and do it safely? Or
there has to be a cultural shift. A friend of mine was the county health director in a county in Georgia, and there was $1 million that became available for parks, and he argued that I don't think we should invest in a great big park way outside of town. We should invest in a bicycle route and smaller, quote-unquote, ribbon parks that would connect one place to another that everyone could use rather than something that people had to drive to. And the Parks Department pushed back and said, no, we're not going to do that. And the doctor said, why? He said, well, if we do that, people will use them all the time. They're much more expensive to maintain. We'd rather have the big, plowed field with grass on it
that doesn't have any brown spots.
That needs to be maintained. And eventually the health officer prevailed, but it took a lot of education
to come to that point. As you've shared all these ideas with our viewers, and you did recommend one book at the beginning of your slides, and maybe you can go back to that so people can be reminded of the one that you mentioned. And while you're doing that, maybe there are 1 or 2 others that you would like to mention for people if they want to get some more information and broaden on this topic that you've been talking about today.
The book that I have here is the book I did with my colleagues, and we are rewriting it, and it's used often as a textbook. I would recommend going to two websites, or at least search on two. One is Smart Growth America. It's a very good organization out of the Washington, D.C. area.
And it's all one word, right?
I would just search on Smart Growth America, and it'll probably
Okay.
give you the correct URL.
Okay, fine.
The other is the Local Government Commission out of Sacramento, California, and they've had a lot of success. The Local Government Commission. I would start with them because those websites will point you in a lot of directions and have a lot of stimulating links and tell you where to go with the books. I've painted a discouraging picture, but big change in the food that's being provided in schools. The schools are going back to PE. There is a lot of focus on kids, and I think actually we have to start with the kids because and you pointed this out, the patterns you set up early in life are very difficult to change. That's all both good news and bad news.
Right, right. And to remind our viewers, we have started the Walk to School. Cynthia Hoyle, who's a consultant at our local transportation, our MTD, has been the instigator of involving schools, and each year a few more schools do it. It only happens one day out of the year, and it's, as you pointed out to everybody, it's sometimes very slow to get these things ingrained, but once a year they do have a walking school bus.
That's the start of it. The thing that really does work is the PTA takes on a Safe Routes to Schools program. Right. The National Transportation Bill will be up for reauthorization next year. It's an enormous piece of legislation.
Yes.
And awful lot of that goes to putting up sound walls and stuff next to highways, and next to nothing goes to your children and grandchildren being able to walk safely to school.
That's right.
And there's every reason that citizenry ought to be demanding stuff that actually meets their needs in terms of the healthiest, the most nature-friendly, the most humane transportation you can do, which is to walk on our own 2 feet.
That's right. And thanks for reminding our viewers of that. Remember, contact your local Congress people on this issue. And as always, I remind our viewers, you're right here in the city of Champaign-Urbana. The university is here. The university has the third largest library in the United States, and within that library is the City Planning and Landscape Architecture Library. You, as a resident of the state, you can use that library, go to the library and look at some of this literature that we've been talking about, and you can gain some other ideas about ways to go about creating the better intersection between urban design and your health, not just obesity, but your own personal health. Thank you so much for giving time to our conversation today and your short visit to our community, and to remind our viewers, planning matters.
Thank you.